When we started this debate, the Minister, the Honourable Nick Smith, set out a number of reasons why we need to pass this bill. He talked about the big increase in levies that would be necessary were it not for the passing of this bill. In particular, he referred to the fact that the person on the average income will end up paying a further $300 a year in the earner's account or the earner's levy. He talked about businesses paying 25% more. So he talked about the impact on levies. He went on to talk about the cost increases that ACC has incurred and the escalating cost of those claims. He said that the cost of claims had increased by some 57% over the last 4 years, from $2.2 billion to $3.5 billion. And he talked about the difference in the approach that both the Labour and the National parties were taking to full funding of the ACC's ongoing liability. And it was interesting that immediately following Nick Smith's speech, we heard from the Honourable David Parker, and he accused the Minister of telling half-truths. In particular, he said that the Labour Party's policy on full funding of that liability to 2019 is well known and well documented. So he said, Mr Minister, Mr Smith, you're misrepresenting our position. He went on to say that it is a consequence of the delay of that full funding that enables those reductions in the levy, or if it weren't for the delay in the full funding, the levies would in actual fact have to go up by $300. So he attempted to answer, and I thought quite reasonably, some of the comments that Mr Smith made. But what was interesting about Mr Parker's response, he was absolutely silent on the issue of the increasing cost of claims. Mr Smith said that the claims had gone up by 57% in 4 years, 5 times the rate of inflation. What was Mr Parker's response to that? He was happy to respond to some of the other claims the Minister made, but he failed to respond to that. And I take that silence, that deafening silence, as an acknowledgement that Mr Parker knows full well that in the last 4 years the cost of claims have gone from $2.2 billion to $3.5 billion, a 57% increase. Mr Smith also said the Honourable Marianne Street, when she signed off on the accounts to June 2008, signed off on a loss of $2.4 billion. $2.4 billion. And I haven't heard any denial of that. The Honourable Marianne Street, quite reasonably in my opinion, has said that in the year to June 2009, that year was impacted by the effect of the world financial crisis. And I think that she has a very valid point. I note, however, that the recovery in the world markets have not reversed that $4.5 billion loss. I also note that Mr Smith acknowledged the impact of the global financial crisis, but he also made the point that of that $2.4 billion loss in 2008, only $1 million was a consequence of those financial losses. Mr Speaker, why do we need this legislation? It must be patently obvious to anyone who has listened to this debate with an unbiased view, Mr Speaker, we need this because the scheme has grown to such an extent that the country can no longer afford it. We cannot continue to go down a fool's paradise, Mr Speaker, where costs increase year after year after year by 5 times the rate of inflation. Mr Speaker, that model is being followed around the world. We see that in Turkey right now. We see that in Spain. We see developed countries in the Western world, sir, facing bankruptcy, not actually being able to go out into the world markets and raise money to pay for the running of those countries. And let's hope, Mr Speaker, that New Zealand never comes to that situation. But, sir, what has driven the significant cost increase? Well, yes, there has been the expansion of the scheme. There has been the expansion of the scheme and a significant number of entitlements. We've talked about suicide. When the ACC legislation was first brought into the House, there was no provision for suicide. As Mr. Smith said, suicide is a tragedy. It is a real tragedy, but it is not an accident. And he is absolutely true. It is not an accident, but it is a tragedy. But Mr. Speaker, I'd like to come back to a point that the Honourable Marianne Street made in her second reading speech, which I've already referred to twice in this debate. And she quite rightly says that with the advances in medical science, people who would normally 20, 30 years ago would have died in an accident can live today. And so that is one of the great things about medical science, is that people who would normally or in past circumstances would have died can live today. And so, but there is a cost to that. And that is a cost that the community is prepared to pay, because life is precious. And people, Mr. Speaker, who do survive accidents, they may survive in a paralysed state, they may even be tetraplegics. And as the Honourable Marianne Street said, the cost of keeping a young person alive for the rest of their life in that state may go up to $20 million. I heard her talk to the House this morning about that cost. And that is a cost that as a society, New Zealanders have been prepared to pay, because life is precious. Life is very precious. But we need to recognise, Mr. Speaker, that comes at a cost. And the cost to the country has been an increase in claims of 12% per annum, 5 times the rate of inflation over the last 4 years. And I think that's also important why we need to have funding the costs as they fall. The ACT Party disagrees with the Green Party, because the reality is when this scheme first came into existence in 1972, medical science was such that people involved in serious accidents, major serious accidents, would probably more likely die than survive. But as time has gone on, the numbers of survivors of what would otherwise be fatal accidents has grown and grown. So one might start, say, with 5 tetraplegics, balloons to 10, to 20, to 50, to 100, to 200. And so the cost, you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, the escalating cost. Now that is a cost that society, New Zealand society, has been prepared to pay. But it's a cost that falls when the accidents occur. Now, I note that the Green Party campaigned at the last election on the figure of the young girl, talking about the future. You've got my future in your hands. Well, I ask, Mr. Hague, why would you bequeath to young people the costs of the previous generation? You drew the distinction about fully funding education and health on a pay-as-we-go model, but that's not how we fund superannuation. And it's certainly not how the Labour Party would like us to fund superannuation, because their plan, of course, was to have the Cullen Fund, the superannuation fund, and when the government moved away from that model, because it wasn't prepared to borrow to fund those investments, we heard all sorts of criticism from the Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, I finally want to come back to the issue of competition and privatisation. Competition and privatisation. Let's not forget that in 1998, the National Party finally had the courage, to open the earners account up for competition. And as a consequence of that, sir, premiums dropped by some 30%. The tragedy, sir, is one, the National Party didn't make that move 6 years earlier, so that benefits that flowed through from that were well and truly embedded when the Labour Party came to power in 1999 and weren't able to dispense with those huge benefits. And finally, the issue of privatisation. I know Mr. Hague criticised privatisation earlier. I compare cataract operations, life-restoring cataract operations that give people the right to see. The reality, Mr. Speaker, ophthalmologists working in public hospitals, as Mr. Hague will well know, will do 3 or 4 operations, sight-restoring operations in a morning or an afternoon, whereas the same operation with the same surgeons working in a private hospital, the output is 8 times. 8 times. That's right, and that is the benefit. That is the benefit of private medicine. That is the benefit of saying to a surgeon, incentivising a surgeon, we want to offer competition, we want to offer choice. And so, Mr. Speaker, the ACT Party will be supporting this bill. We do it proudly, and we only wish it hadn't been necessary, because if the National Party had the courage to make the changes that were required in 92 and 93, the scheme wouldn't be in the state of the financial disrepair it is today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Rahuri Katani.
Mr. Speaker,